WSR steering committee, so I've been asked to fill in for our current beloved leader, Dr. Majabin Gala, who is suffering from some back issues and could not make it. So we want to, first of all, since this was her last leadership event, we want to just honor her, dedicate this time to her, and hopefully we will hear from her perhaps at a fall event. So today we have a wonderful panel, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Paula Nesbitt, who is going to serve as moderator, and she will make the introductions of the faculty speakers. So I invite you to sit back, enjoy, learn, take notes, and hopefully we'll have wonderful dialogue with our faculty presenters. Thank you.
The theme for our panel this spring is the role of religion in women's studies. Just a quick addendum to that theme is that from my experience in teaching in secular institutions prior to affiliating with the GTU, women's studies and religion has been a contested combination oftentimes. And much of it has to do with the lack of knowledge and awareness of the multiplicity of understandings of religion. And that speaks to the value of the Women's Studies and Religion program, and particularly the scholarship that we will be hearing this afternoon. The Women's Studies and Religion program here is lengthy and very well-respected history in the academy. I think without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We will have a little bit of extra time for discussion today, which I hope that all of you will engage in with our panelists and with one another. The first paper will be presented by Dr. Paula Arai Eshini and Kakushini, Professor of Women and Religion, Women and Buddhist Studies at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. And the second paper will be presented by Dr. Deidre Green, GTU Assistant Professor of Latter-day Saints. We will have both presentations, and then we will open up the floor for questions, comments, and open discussion. So, Dr. Arai. Thank you, Paula.
Well, it's wonderful that we can still meet today, and I'm eager to share my new work with you all, especially because in the field of Buddhist studies, we are very far behind Christianity in its work with women. And so what I have to present, I'm curious if it's just I've reinvented the wheel with a few tweaks, or you know, is there something that's distinctly Buddhist that you hear? So that all people come out of a woman's womb is an underappreciated fact in much of historical analysis. It is often treated as if it were just a metaphor. The fact that a woman, among other things, the Buddhist tradition would not have been born is in some ways simplistic and other ways pivotal. Focusing on this fact can help us see how women have been practically, historically, and conceptually vital to the founding and development of this tradition. Women who gave birth 2,500 years ago did not need modern feminist theory to tell them that their bodies were powerful sources of life. Their sons and daughters alike traversed her birth canal. Keenly aware of their bodily needs, she nourished her sons and daughters with her breast milk. She encouraged their walking and talking. That some sons grew up and wrote down ideas and prescribed rules that did not respect her does not erase her knowledge that her sons were as dependent on her for their survival as were her daughters. What difference might this perspective make on how we interpret women? We can open more space for seeing and understanding historical and contemporary women by developing interpretations of teachings and practices that are filtered through a woman's gaze. A woman's gaze is multifarious. It shapes and is shaped by numerous conditions, including socio-historical and cultural contexts, linguistic, economic, and political dynamics. Religious teachings sought or that frame the environment of concern, and concept of gender employed by the person and or community in question. No normal, standard, or essential qualities for woman or female can be objectively determined from the vast diversity of perspectives across time and location. We can hone our ability to see and understand women inspired and energized by the Buddhist teachings on the cessation of suffering and practice of compassion by interpreting the historical evidence regarding women recorded in texts, expressed in art and architecture, codified in rules, institutionalized in organizational structures, and encoded in ritual practices. In lieu of explicit evidence of women's internal thought processes, we can proffer suggestions that take women's agency into account and imagine how one must navigate situations to ameliorate suffering. It is more illuminating to launch such an inquiry not with the question, did women seek the cessation of suffering, which is shockingly not obvious, but rather, how did women seek the cessation of suffering? Adding one word, how, opens up avenues of insight that regard women as agents in their own lives, as caring, hardworking, and serious. Exploring the cumulative tradition from the perspective of women's concerns will help us uncover creative ways women might have integrated teachings on wisdom and loving kindness into their lives. Consider how Siddhartha's father so wanted his son to become a wheel turner of the political world that he went to great lengths to shield him from suffering in order to increase the odds his son would not go on a quest to stop suffering. In contrast, women's lives of the era were intimate with suffering. Death in childbirth, nurturing and burying their babies, caring for the sick, tending to the needs of aged and dying elders. To think that across 2,500 years of the Buddhist tradition, there haven't been women who sought and gained wisdom regarding healing responses to suffering is a hard case to make. Drawing inspiration from historical and contemporary Buddhist women, I have developed 9 principles for a woman-centered hermeneutic. Discerning or imagining creative responses to suffering is the fourth. In contrast to the prominent historical focus on male domination and misogyny, which centers on men's actions, I will focus on liberation and how a person might respond to oppression by wielding liberating power. Where Buddhist texts or practices present negativity toward women, I invite us to consider the proof for such assessments and imagine possible female liberating perspectives. I encourage seeing how a woman or anyone might apply Dharma teachings and practices in conditions of oppressive suffering, whether historical or current. So these are my 9 principles for wielding liberating power. 1, breathe space for not knowing. It is beneficial to remind ourselves how little evidence is available to know how most people thought and felt throughout history, especially those without resources or inclination to record their own contributions. It behooves us to also keep in mind that the lack of evidence is not the evidence of lack. In consciously foregrounding the countless neglected threads from our current version of the fabric of reality, we breathe space for new information, insights, and perspectives. We open up space to explore and imagine. 2, look through expansive and contextualized lenses. Given the sleuthing nature of recovering or imagining how women might wield liberating power, it is beneficial to look through both expansive and contextualized lenses. To see any specific event in the context of its broader surrounding is critical to ascertaining the impulses coursing through what has occurred or is transpiring. Oscillate between wide-ranging and tightly focused perspectives can generate insights that arise from juxtaposing shifting viewpoints. Decentering and recentering information promotes fresh awareness, often bringing to light concerns and values that influence people. 3, account for our interdependence. Accounting for our interdependence illuminates the fact that nothing occurs in isolation, and everything has ramifications. It beckons us to not ignore, dismiss, or discount anyone in our effort to understand ourselves. The crux of interdependence is a koan, a Buddhist riddle, I guess you can say. How do we wield liberating power in a context that is replete with oppressive institutions, teachings, and practices? That's the koan, that's the conundrum. 4, navigate with one eye on ideal aims and another eye on raw realities. As with any effort to fathom human activity, it is crucial to explore what people face in their lives, aspire to, and assume about reality. Not losing sight of ideal aims safeguards against the imagination dulling effects of bitterness and cynicism. Keeping an eye on raw realities safeguards against ignoring, diminishing, or dismissing the experiences of people, especially those who are perceived to be inferior. 5, examine the impact teachings or practices have on suffering. Absence of conscious intention to cause suffering does not mean that suffering does not result. Our interrelatedness notwithstanding, teachings and practices that may be skillful in one situation may not be in another. Therefore, it behooves us to be vigilant in assessing whether teachings or practices have the potential to be oppressive. Notice whether the people who advocate the teachings or practices hold positions of structural power. Consider the substantiation offered to support a pronouncement, especially if it asserts the inferiority or incapacity of some people. If no proof is offered or the reasoning is not compelling, resist accepting the assertion, even if it is in a text ascribed as scripture or authoritative, and it is made by a person broadly recognized as a leader or teacher. 6, assume women want to stop suffering. To assume women, really everyone, want to stop suffering is humanizing. It acknowledges sentience as well as highlights self-respect and agency. Anticipating a person's motivational drive, it facilitates discerning what they might have cared about and what they thought was worth working hard for. Imagine women experimenting with ways to ease the hardships that often attend birthing. Nourishing, clothing and housing the family, nursing the sick, and caring for the elderly and dying. Except for birthing, these activities are not necessarily women's work. They are essential work, though, and women do tend to perform these tasks. To acknowledge that such work is often done by women is not to relegate them to such work. Rather, it validates the women who make these crucial contributions to their community. Reflecting on what would not be possible without this work is a way to see what women value and deem worthy of their support. 7, move through an embodied perspective. An embodied perspective of Buddhist liberation is practical. It examines if a teaching mitigates suffering. It experiments with a practice to ascertain if it meets a need. If not, then one explores other routes until an effective one is found. An embodied perspective does not tarry on abstract notions of right, wrong, or good, bad, for it sees morality and virtue as acts that do not cause suffering. It seeks ways to cultivate loving kindness and compassion. It promotes identifying and analyzing the dynamics of a situation, as well as prompt potential liberating strategies. 8, seek compassionate interpretations of teachings and practices. Dharma teachings and practices are those that, after having been tested, are verified to effectively liberate beings from suffering. What is helpful for some, however, might not be helpful for others. Ascertaining that which effectively allays suffering is the key to wielding liberating power. For some teachings and practices that cause suffering have been incorporated under the vast umbrella of the term Buddhism. In the process of identifying that which is effective, it is important to humanize the authors of sutras, of scriptures, and teachers of practices. When encountering a situation that produces suffering, blaming, shaming, or accusing are understandable responses. In being inherently divisive and driven by incomplete perspectives, however, they do not extract the root of a problem. Nonetheless, understanding the dynamics behind actions that cause suffering is central to sorting out what ameliorates suffering. Therefore, seeking an interpretation that both acknowledges the problem and discerns that what would effectively stop the suffering is a more skillful response. I call this approach a hermeneutics of compassion. It involves measured reflection and is not quick to generalize or judge. It is not a veiled way to find excuses for perpetrators and blame victims, nor does it exonerate discrimination. Sometimes the compassionate response to teachings and practices is to not follow them, for they are not effective in helping you stop suffering. In short, a hermeneutics of compassion assesses what kinds of actions, including thoughts, might be liberating. 9. Learn or imagine how a woman wields liberating power in response to negative treatment, structures, or environments. That so many people have survived childhood, and many even make it to old age, indicates that women develop ways to allay suffering, cultivate life-sustaining wisdom, and effectively wield liberating power. Moreover, we can enlist our imaginations as a tool to open our minds to stimulate reinterpretations of available material that are considered from an androcentric perspective. Exploring ways women might have responded to negative treatment, structures, and environments will enhance our ability to interpret such events. By extending the sweep of our attention, we can expand our knowledge of women's ingenuity, insights, and strengths. These 9 principles of a woman-centered hermeneutics can help us weave subtle detail and luster into the fabric of our Buddhist narrative, and to open us to recognizing the many ways Buddhists, past and present, respond to suffering and seek liberation. And since we have extra time, I'm adding a story that I wrote applying all these 9 principles to the most heinous Buddhist scripture I could find. It was a challenge. I thought, how in the world are you going to wield liberating power in the face of this? So this is what I came up with. The Blood Pond Sutra, a late 12th century Chinese apocryphal sutra, reveals how ingenious women can be. Women in China and Japan developed strategies to navigate the scripture that contended all women go to a hell pool filled with blood spilled during childbirth and menstruation when they got fed. Evidence suggests women who were not primary wives, I can skip that. There was a positive thing that it did for women who were considered concubines. We'll jump on that. The Blood Pond Sutra began circulating in Japan during the 15th century. Japanese women also created ways to have the sutra support them and not just denigrate and oppress them. Taking cues from evidence of what women in Japan did, I narrate a story that animates how women did and can wield liberating wisdom when faced with a Buddha's words that deems their bodies a source of suffering, arising from their capacity to give birth. Our story begins in a village at the foot of Mount Takayama, a towering volcanic mountain known to have a blood pond hell. I've actually footnoted all the actual historical information, so this is not untethered to evidence, but I'm not going to be able to share that with you. But this was one of them. There was such a blood pond on Mount Takayama. Women who live there come to life through passages from Tora-san's diary. In the first entry, she is a newly married 17-year-old. October 20, 1848. I went to my first gathering of the 19th night group last night. I'm still shaken by the sutra we chanted. The older women there seemed unfazed by it. Afterwards, some even laughed about it. How can they take it so lightly? They clearly understand something I don't. I do seem to be behind in learning about some women's things, I guess that's not surprising since Mama died giving birth to Kiku. Having helped raise my younger sister, I look forward to having children, especially since I have keen thoughts about how not to do it. Our stepmother treated us as burdens, even when we tried to help. I would not have even known about this woman's gathering had my new mother-in-law not encouraged me to go. There were about 15 women there last night. Although I was a bit shy being introduced as the newest and youngest to join the group, I felt warmly welcomed. It was comforting to be surrounded by women who were near my age, as well as women who had clearly weathered many seasons of life. Some were quiet, others were somewhat outspoken with a great sense of humor. I felt like I belonged, like the lad I felt growing up without my mother would be filled. We did a short ritual. There was an endearing carving of Myoi Kanno, a bodhisattva of compassion, on a low table at the front of the room. The women rotate who is to bring flowers and food offerings. One of the older women lit a candle and incense. Another woman rang a bell indicating when to bow. After 3 bows, we chanted the Heart Sutra. Like most people, I could chant by memory. Then they began to chant a sutra I had never heard before. Why were women in hell wallowing in a pond full of menstrual blood and forced to drink it? Beaten with an iron rod if they refused? Wasn't a sutra supposed to be the words of an enlightened being? What is going on? The part about washing out our monthly cause polluting the water tea is made with is infuriating because women are very careful about such things. And man must have written this. The ritual ended with prayers. Some prayed for getting pregnant, others prayed for a safe birth for their baby and themselves. Women added prayers for sisters and friends who were not there, some because they were caring for sick children. After the personal prayers, the women intoned a formal prayer in unison, paraphrasing the actual scripture. May all women be released from the blood pond hell and reborn in the Buddha's land. Most of the evening was spent sharing stories. One elder woman, who seemed to be a special visitor, guided us by weaving wisdom into her tale of affliction and adversity. The night drew to a close with a bell and a bow. As I walked out, a middle-aged woman came over to welcome me. She had an especially warm smile and a sparkle in her eyes. Her name is Kane-san. I immediately sensed her care. She is how I imagined Mama would be if she were still around. I miss her. November 20, 1848. It's hard to believe 1 month has already passed. During casual conversation over tea, I felt like I was being initiated into a woman's world of unvarnished honesty and humor. When one young woman complained about her cramps, a refreshingly salty woman named Kuma-san exclaimed, "That's why we don't have to do certain rituals and such when we're on the rag. Men think they're controlling us because we're polluted, but really it's because they're afraid of blood. They have no idea that their rules are really giving us a break when we need it most. Besides, who wants to move around a lot and risk soiling our clothes? There's enough at the laundry as it is." Kane-san even chimed in. She thought these rules were humane because they gave women time to rest and be restored by having a respite to reflect. These women's gatherings, fantastic. January 20th, 1849. I missed my period. This is the first time it's happened. I'm usually so regular, so it must be. Before going to the gathering, I was a tumult of emotions. I was excited about becoming a mother, but fear of dying like Mama felt like a typhoon roaring through me. I was practically paralyzed with the thought that I can't even say that a storm would return my baby to the waters. My best friend was still struggling to get up and prepare food after what happened to hers. When I shared this at the gathering, I could feel the fear of dying in childbirth ripple through the circle of women. Tomi-san chanted Namam Butsu under her breath. Kane-san walked over to me, held my hands, and looked deeply into my eyes. You are not alone. We are here for you. As we chanted the Blood Pond Sutra together, instead of being repulsed by it, I felt embraced in a wave of understanding. Their voices bathed me in compassion. They all prayed for me with a sincerity that made me feel it would be all right. February 20, 1849. Kami-san gave me an amulet to protect me through pregnancy and delivery. She had traveled to Kumano-Hikuni, a kind of Buddhist nun known for understanding the types of suffering women face. It turns out it was the elder woman who had shared a powerful story that first night. I joined the gathering. Kami-san trusted this nun, so she wanted to get the special Blood Pond Sutra amulet from her. There are many Kumano-Hikuni who travel around supporting women with teachings and these special amulets. I peeked inside the cloth amulet. On very thin paper, a copy of the Blood Pond Sutra was inside. May 20, 1849. My belly was suddenly swelling, throwing off my balance. I've learned that means things are progressing on schedule. Kane-san knew how to wrap the long cotton sash, a hara-obi, just tight enough to support my growing belly and relieve the strain on my lower back. She tucked the amulet she had given me in between the folds of the obi so it would stay close to my body. I felt both protected and less back pain. On August 10, 1849, my daughter, Hatsu, was born. We are both safe. The Blood Pond Sutra amulet works. Of course, the women and their prayers saw me through too. And I'm looking at the time, and although the story is exciting through many different events, I think you get the gist of the idea of how you can take this sutra and see if the key to me was that in taking an embodied perspective. I thought if you get a bunch of women in the room that get an evening off from their regular work, they are going to talk with each other about what they're experiencing, and they will support each other. So that was the key to unraveling what otherwise looks like a very misogynist text. So I'll stop here and look forward to hearing your thoughts when we have a chance to do this.
Thank you, Dr. Lai, for a very enlightening presentation on a Buddhist women's liberation praxis. Our second paper is by Dr. Deidre Green, and the title of her paper is Engendering Joy.
Through most of Dr. Arai's paper, I was luxuriating and reveling in some really lovely points of resonance between our two papers, but there are no stories about pools of menstrual blood in my paper, so this is going to be anticlimactic. Joy as a theological concept is too often viewed as an aspirational or otherworldly ideal, rather than as an essential aspect of human existence. I believe that joy ought to be viewed as definitive for what it means to be human, characterizing both individual and collective life. Joy plays a vital role not only in personal transformation, but also the transformation of the world, as it allows us to sustain engagement in projects of social justice. As a constructive feminist theologian specializing in the thought of Søren Kierkegaard, I draw on Kierkegaard's unique notion of this concept to reclaim joy for theology in a way that fits the realities of precariousness and precarity in which we live, and that allows us to work hopefully for change. This joy is related to the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, embodied by marginalized biblical figures that Kierkegaard lifts up as exemplary for attaining subjectivity despite social structures that undermine our self-development. His conception of joy is available to even the most marginalized and offers resources to resist marginalization. In this presentation, I will show how Mary, the mother of Jesus, exemplifies the hope and courage that undergird the efficacious struggle for joy in the face of structures that make it elusive for those without social privilege. Kierkegaard views joy as the telos of human existence, yet this joy is not merely an affect, not something one simply feels. Instead, it is something a human being is to become. His view proves useful, particularly in the times in which we are living, because he offers a non-effective notion of what it means to be joyful, calling the human being to actually be joy. For Kierkegaard, a purpose of human life that can only be fulfilled by properly relating to God, self, and others is to uncover and enhance joy as the basic existential mode of the human being over and above despair or anxiety. He describes this joy as being present to oneself, in contrast to the disconnection from one's authentic nature that characterizes despair. Turning readers' attention to the more than human world, Kierkegaard points to the wonder of creation that is out there in the field of the lilies, where every human being is what God has made him to be. Tellingly, and in a way that offers a resource for resistance against the privileging of trauma and suffering over joy, although Kierkegaard's religious writings are saturated with injunctions to imitate Jesus Christ, by focusing his discussion of joy on the lilies and the birds, he demonstrates a valuation of joy over suffering and death, indicating that the divine wills humanity's joy. For Kierkegaard, the joy that is present to oneself and the present time is a contemporaneous way of existing, compatible with simultaneously bearing extremely deep sorrow. The lily and the bird teach how to be unconditionally joyful by unconditionally casting all their sorrow upon God. I wish to highlight that this repetitive action relies on recognition of one's total dependence on another. Although it might be tempting to gain mastery over sorrow and suffering by seeking to control it through sacrifice or masochism, it is the willingness to relinquish control by instead offering up suffering that affords joy. Furthermore, although some might reject a notion of joy dependent on the divine, it is still instructive to conceive of joy as a matter of interdependence, which is only possible through right relations. Moreover, insofar as joy is to become constitutive of the self and is a matter of interdependence, this concept illuminates the intersubjectivity operative in Kierkegaard's thought. But what does this process of becoming joy and becoming a subject actually look like? In a way that reverses normal conceptions of self-emptying and self-sacrifice, Kierkegaard maintains that it is equally imperative that one not cast away one's joy, as it is that one utterly purge oneself of sorrow. In the case of joy, quote, you are to hold on to it with all your might, with all your life force. If you do that, then you will always retain some joy, because if you cast away all your sorrow, you of course retain only whatever joy you have. The absolute release of sorrow and absolute clinging to joy clarify the dynamics by which joy comes to be embodied and constitutive of one's personhood, which occurs only through the individual's free choice. In the corpus, Kierkegaard offers implicit examples of what this might look like in human life. He illustrates the surrender of what is not essential or authentic to oneself, including social roles that are prescribed to one and entail shame. This surrender that makes way for authentic identity and joyful communion with others is exemplified in Sarah of Tobit's prayer, the woman with the alabaster box of silent confession and anointing of Christ, and Mary's fiat at the Annunciation. In the book I'm working on, I dedicate chapters to each of those three women. Today I'll just focus on Mary. I believe Kierkegaard's kenotic trajectory of emptying oneself of sorrow, or by extension, inauthentic identity, shame, and alienation, offers a concrete way to respond to post-colonial theologian Anne Doe's call to live with heart, despite brokenheartedness. She, like other feminist and liberation theologians, makes plain that joy and not suffering alone must sustain the effort both to recreate and to be recreated. While remaking the world and the self entails sacrifice and suffering, communal and individual joy must be the end goal and the driving force that pervade the acts of sacrifice involved. Joy is neither a luxury nor something that can be postponed to some post-mortal realm. It must be claimed and proliferated in the here and now. While human beings may ultimately need to depend on God for the fulfillment of joy, they are also obligated to create the conditions conducive to joy for all members of society. Reconfiguring Kierkegaard's dynamics of sorrow and joy for our current context in relation to social justice efforts, sorrow might represent the acknowledgement of the truth of a devastating reality, and the casting away of sorrow in exchange for the embrace of joy might represent the refusal to be immobilized by the devastation. This refusal engenders an ability to acknowledge possibility and work hopefully for a more joyful collective reality. A Kierkegaardian conception of sorrow and joy, then, illuminates how to do both truth-telling and hope-telling, naming real problems and working to ameliorate them, without privileging one at the expense of the other. To read Kierkegaard in this way is to acknowledge the role of acceptance in both activism and joy in a way that resonates with practitioner activists such as the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu, who both acknowledge that their activism comes from a deep acceptance of what is, noting that the only way to attain the joy humanity is designed to experience is by giving up denial about what exists. For Kierkegaard, joy moves us beyond acceptance to encourage active, on-the-ground engagement with the world. Faith does not entail being lifted above the messiness of embodied existence. Instead of being extricated from existential difficulties, those who embrace the life of faith are thrown back into them. Yet because the faithful individual is defined by joy, she possesses the ability not to succumb to the anxiety that might otherwise convince her to abandon her efforts at striving to create a better world. On my reading of Kierkegaard, joy is a way of being that allows human beings to see difficult problems and sit with them, rather than denying them through a toxic optimism and address them productively. Kierkegaardian joy facilitates continual envisioning that recognizes transformative possibilities conducive to collective flourishing. This vision itself can engender joy, since, as Mary Clark Moschella notes, joy creates sport when the divine possibility is made known. The joy associated with this possibility sustains the efforts to make it a reality as well. Amy Hollywood insists that, quote, the energy for efficacious action comes not solely through melancholy, but also through joy, through a love of the world that in love demands change. The integration of both into our spiritual lives and our engagement with the world requires work on ourselves and work on the world, an unalienated labor in and through which we become who we are. For Hollywood, this work demands that we give up a facile dualism that prizes joy over suffering or vice versa. Not suffering or joy, for we can't have one without the other. We can't live well. We can't live on sorrow and anger and rage alone. By remaining present to oneself in the face of suffering, tragedy, death, etc., one can further maintain motivation to ameliorate the problems one encounters in the world. Joy then is not only the ultimate objective of human existence, as well as a way of knowing, seeing, and being with reality, it can also be understood as countercultural and as an act of resistance. Embodying this countercultural resistant joy requires courage, which Kierkegaard defines as daring to exist for the whole range of one's times. Such courage enables joyful existence within current circumstances and empowers personal and social change through ongoing embodiment of our deepest values. Kierkegaard develops specific ideas of courage that I see as essential to a joyful life, especially for those on the margins and with a relative lack of privilege. In my remaining time, I will discuss what he calls humble courage and the related concept of frimodigheid, which is best understood as openness, or as I propose, as open-hearted, courageous trust. In the larger project, I associate these concepts closely with the theological virtues, especially hope. Kierkegaard closely associates all of these virtues with female figures from scripture, and I believe he recognizes that especially for those with marginalized identities, the struggle for joy against myriad social forces that stymie it require courage in multiple forms and on multiple fronts. In my brief time today, I will discuss just one exemplar, Mary, whose miraculous pregnancy made her vulnerable to social condemnation and ostracism. By lifting up her characteristic humble courage and frimodigheid, or openness, enacted in her departure from social norms and expectations over and above the larger Christian tradition's emphasis on Mary's virginity and purity, Kierkegaard radically departs from that tradition, re-envisioning Mary in a way that highlights her subjectivity, which develops through her hopeful response to God in the face of extreme adversity. He notes that although Mary's prediction in the Magnificat that future generations would call her blessed for being Jesus' mother proved true, This contrasts with the fact that her own generation, quote, saw in her the most unfortunate of all women. This portrait contributes to his high esteem of her. He opines in his journal, "This is the measure of what a human being is. For how large a portion of his contemporaries does he dare exist and allow his life to be judged by them?" To become who she is meant to become, Mary confronts the possibility of being an offense to others, herself, and for society. She both threatens its social order and is threatened by its erroneous perception of her. Her willingness to risk not being loved and even being hated to fulfill her unique vocation makes Mary great in Kierkegaard's eyes. In Christian scripture, Mary boldly declares that through her role as Jesus' mother, God has, quote, scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts, has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly, and has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. With this declaration, Mary points to a qualitative distinction between hope from a position of privilege, which amounts to an optimism that entrenches unjust relations, and from a marginal position, which disrupts a world of despair. Mary understands her calling to bear the Son of God as disruptive, an overturning of the established order. Kierkegaard proves especially attuned to this, I believe. Unlike the Christian tradition's emphasis on an exemplariness that reinforces the status quo of social norms and gendered submission, he highlights her defiance of them. The hope Mary expresses in the Magnificat about what God will accomplish through her is not ethereal, but situated in this world and concerned with material conditions in her own and future generations. It is this expanded perspective of the large-scale impact of her choices on others that impel her to act with humble courage and primotive for openness to fulfill a singular vocation that might be too daunting otherwise. Mary is such a prime example of Kierkegaard's theological concepts of humble courage and openness that these concepts are largely introduced in juxtaposition to his discussion of her. Humble courage facilitates a person's active responsiveness to God, rather than blind obedience, keeping the heart open, receptive, and soft, rather than hardening it through fear, as one might be inclined to do when encountering an angel who pronounces an unimaginable vocation that can only be fulfilled by miraculous means. Humble courage is essential for relating properly to one's own finitude and living joyfully in the finite. In contrast to a purely human courage, which renounces the finite world in favor of eternity, a paradoxical and humble courage, which includes faith and hope in the divine, can, quote, grasp the whole temporal realm now. Humble courage recognizes one's individual agency as operating most effectively in the context of interdependence. Courage empowers one to act in spite of fear, and humility acknowledges that one necessarily depends on others for the fulfillment of efficacious action. And I'll note here that Kierkegaard's view of sin is unique in that he sees fear and sin, or fear and pride rather, as kind of two sides of the same coin. And so humble courage seems to be a direct response to that way of theorizing sin. The fact that Mary cannot bring about divine objectives without help from both the divine and other human beings serves as impetus for the hope that supports taking risks that prove to be generative for both herself and others. Philosopher Adrienne M. Martin argues that interpersonal hope should be conceptualized in terms of socially extended agency. When we invest hope in each other, what we hope for is to extend our agency through each other. Mary invests hope in others because she views bringing the divine will to fruition as not only formidable, but impossible on her own. Her lack of personal ability to fulfill what is asked of her heightens her awareness of her need to extend her agency socially, which ultimately contributes to her accomplishing more in relation to the divine and human others than could someone who probably believed they could fulfill ultimate divine objectives on their own. Mary's dependence on God and other human beings demands that she invest her hope in them and allows her to meet the needs of others, including future generations whose hope for salvation cannot be fulfilled without her. Kierkegaard's courage is nowhere needed more than in relationship to God, who demands the most of human beings. In Carlyle's estimation, humble courage, epitomized by Mary in her encounter with Gabriel at the Annunciation, constitutes the cardinal virtue, as it allows one to remain still and silent in the face of death, so that it can hear a word that may change everything. Courage is staying completely present to the moment, caring for it, and responding properly to it. This courageous capacity comes from a hope that is rooted in love. Simone de Beauvoir sums up love's ability to stay still rather than running away in a way that echoes Carlyle's discussion on humble courage. Quote, "When I love, when I desire, I flee nothing." love for the divine, other people, including the child she will bear, and love for herself and her own desire to realize her vocation, allowed her to go forward amid the unknown rather than retreating. Beyond refusing to retreat, Mary makes a bold and calm affirmation in response to the angel's appearance, quote, "Here I am." This declaration of wholeheartedness, resoluteness, and transparency reveal the open-hearted, courageous trust that bolsters subjectivity and stealing joy from a society structured to deny it to those on the margins. Humble courage, like joy, affords the capacity to be present and responsive to whatever we confront in the world and work in tandem with others for the world's betterment. Like humble courage, frimodighed, I have to keep saying the Danish because it's very difficult to translate into English and it's highly contested. Frimodighed, or what I'm referring to as openness or open-hearted, courageous trust, takes confidence from the fact that it can rely on other agents as well as oneself. It includes the assurance that one does not have to face life's dangers alone. Openness to help from both divine and human others expands possibility in a way that affords hope not only in an afterlife or the distant future, but in the here and now. Kierkegaard vividly depicts a less robust notion of hope as, quote, "an old woman who stares longingly," whereas confidence, or frimodighed, is energy and action. In a way that resonates with his definition of joy, Kierkegaard clarifies that this active expression of oneself stems from the fact that frimodighed is hope's present time, in contrast to a more tenuous version of hope as wistfulness. This facet of hope elucidates why it is inextricable from the process of making joy constitutive of the self. In contradistinction to wishing, which essentially relates to sadness, hope sustains joy. Her joyful and hopeful way of being present in the moment allows Mary to declare, "Here I am in the face of uncertainty." It indicates a trusting, God-devoted disposition, a cheerful and unhesitating willingness to face trials, and an ability to do so bravely. The fact that Kierkegaard contends that love is the source of openness and boldness helps to explain its priority in human life and its role in grounding the other virtues, such as hope. This relationship highlights why hope motivates action rather than complacency. Courage and openness, buttressed by love, allow human beings to be with the world as it is and see it clearly in a way that is not immobilizing, but enlivening. Moreover, Mary's humble courage allows her to receive help from divine and human others to fulfill her vocation, both becoming who she is meant to be and fulfilling a task that she could not do on her own. By recognizing her interdependence, Mary gains capacity to support the subjectivity and flourishing of others as well. Kierkegaard departs from the Reformation tradition by conceptualizing Mary not as an ideal housewife or the picture of unadulterated chastity, but rather as one who stands apart from the social order in a way that is requisite for, rather than opposed or ancillary to, the divine objectives for her life. Kierkegaard's reading of Mary holds forth hope for women that their lives of faith can consist of creative resistance and social change rather than mere compliance, and that in these efforts they can amplify the joy and flourishing of themselves and others.
Thank you for that very stimulating paper. We have a few minutes for questions, reflections. Does anybody have any comments or questions for our panelists?
I want to thank you both for very, very exciting papers, and it seems a common theme that's running through both involve agency and action and self-awareness. And so I'd appreciate if you speak more to how in the applications of your papers, affirmations of what you're saying in this contemporary time, speak more to how we can encourage one another to find that agency and action in a world that discourages or seeks to quiet things.
So I'll go first just because I'm the first speaker, but I echo that there were resonances between our work that was, exciting to hear, and that's exactly why we have women studies and doing such things. So the point about assuming women want to stop suffering. I came upon that because there are systems in place that require people to suffer in order for things to work the way they do. And if the Buddhist teachings are about how do you stop suffering, just like you know, echoing what the humble courage and to accept reality as it is the key to how you stop suffering. The not being in denial. So facing it, and then we can affirm for each other that, you know, that this is rigged against me. And to encourage each other that there are ways we can be creative in responding. And not to assume all these authoritative sources were really on your side. To face that reality, and the basic Buddhist injunction at the beginning of the tradition is it test everything out, and if it generates suffering, stop doing that and try something else, experiment. There's no absolute path. And so just like the subaltern, the oppressed, you see it all over the place throughout history, that in order to survive, you need to be aware of what the people who think they're holding you down think about you, and think, or not think about you, but think what's going on. And so to not give the power away to those people, and so much, especially in the field of Buddhist studies, you know, when people started looking at women, all they could see was, from my perspective, what the men said women couldn't do and how bad they were, how inferior they were. And back 30 years ago, I've had a peripatetic career because 30 years ago, I said, well, let's look at what the women did do for themselves that was positive. And not just have the whole story be how the tradition is misogynist, because the women, the vast majority of them, I doubt they were misogynist. And to label the whole tradition misogynist is to then once again try and disempower and invalidate a woman who's got some ideas. And so the field is finally beginning to see, okay, the response to the suffering, what do you do? But it has been a tremendous effort to keep that possibility open on the table. People don't want to hear it. How powerful and resilient women have been, and it's beginning to shift. But I've even had someone who's recognized as a Zen master tell me that I can't come to the conclusion that women are powerful because it's just not true. And so because he's a Zen master, you know, I could have said, oh, maybe I'm wrong. But every fiber in my being was, no, he is wrong. But it was decades before anyone would listen to such a story and believe that it was true. I'm going on and on. You can tell I have a lot of thoughts on this, but to encourage people today who are in situations where the system is rigged against them. Perseverance, determination, stick together, believe each other, affirm each other, and there's no easy fix. It's a long road, but it the distance sometimes between believing it for yourself can be just as long, but that's the one we have control over. So to keep supporting each other, so you roll those obstacles and put in your own mind and heart, thinking that maybe you aren't good enough.
Yeah, I'd love to answer. Yeah, I would say epithely, right, I really wanna lift up this notion of thinking about joy as a form of resistance, like that is very appealing to me, and I think really important. I agree with Paula that women work very hard to alleviate the suffering of other people, but a lot of my work has focused on issues around self-sacrifice, what I would call sadomasochism, within religious traditions, specifically within the Christian tradition, which is where I do most of my theologizing. And so I'm a little bit concerned about that, right? And so I think part of why this project matters to me so much is I think while women have been socialized and are deeply invested in alleviating the suffering of others, they don't necessarily have a strong sense that their own joy or their own flourishing is valuable or a priority. And so that's part of why I think this notion of intersubjectivity within the project that I'm developing like matters so much, because I think as women, largely those who are socialized to think about others, recognize that these work together, right? And that our subjectivity depends on one another, that can be a sort of motivation. Another thing I want to point out is that, and what I developed to a larger extent within my larger project, is that joy is a capacity. And so it's a capacity that needs to be expanded. And I think especially when we're thinking about traumatized individuals or populations, we need to think about how to work collectively to create the conditions in which people can expand those capacities, right? So part of it is about changing material conditions, but part of it is also about just doing very embodied sort of somatic work of how to take a traumatized community or a traumatized individual and help them to start slow. Because joy, right? Joy can be terrifying. I mean, from what we know from trauma studies, joy can be a physiological impossibility, right? For someone who's extremely traumatized. And so thinking about that collectively. And then maybe the last point, something that's really influenced this project, but I can talk about it in this particular presentation, is, it was really motivated by Amy Hollywood's work in Acute Melancholia, where she talks about trauma has come to take on an epistemic authority in contemporary society that she really wants to challenge. And I want to actually maintain that I think trauma and certainly experiences of marginalization do offer sort of epistemic authority and epistemic privilege. I don't want to challenge it quite as much as I think she does. But I do agree with her basic argument that we also want to lift up joy as a source of epistemic authority, and that we can learn from joy as much as we can learn from trauma. And so I think that that's another thing for us to think about collectively. How do we create even kind of micro experiences of joy that might stimulate our imagination, right? To use Paula's phrase, and think more expansively about how to be transgressive in a society that is not conducive to the joy and flourishing of lots and lots of people.
Wonderful, thank you, sir. I just want to say thank you both so much. It's just really remarkable and such a beautiful fruit of how important women's studies is, what we do is. But just a couple of comments I just felt in both, like as you said, Paula, that we're being asked to, rules were made for us by the sons, that concept that didn't take into account who women were, that idea, how crippling that can be. And what I feel you're both calling for is like, Dr. Green, what you said, that power and surrender as epitomized in Mary. That you've just given us a different lens to turn and use the tools that we have and not wait to try to undo all those rules that the sons made for us that and don't fit, and they're not making the world work either, that kind of idea. So I would love to hear, it is so liberating, all of it, you know, so just that idea of, that idea of reshaping and remaking. But to even articulate, okay, in our worlds, what are some first steps, you know, what are some daily practices even? Yeah, something like that, you know, how do we begin to move some of this forward? Of moving in a new direction that is so empowering and I think holds so much potential of reshaping, not just for women, but for all. That's good, thank you.
Well, I'll just keep it short, but my first thought is a first step you can make, because that's what you can control, is do, every morning a minute of meditation on self-love and loving kindness, pouring it into yourself. Because of, I agree with what Deirdre was saying about all this of loving others and that pressure, does help you cultivate the skill of loving, but the piece that often gets missed is the self-love, as if it's selfish or somehow not as important. So when you love yourself, then you have more capacity to be patient, to be more creative, to see someone who is maybe trying to push themselves on you and see their suffering and not see them as the enemy.
Yeah, I love that, and I just wanna add, right, working within Christian theology, and one of the things that I really appreciate about Kierkegaard's work specifically is his work on neighbor love really emphasizes that piece of self-love as intrinsic to the two great commandments, right? And I think whatever tradition you're working from, I think it's worthwhile to think carefully about an actual theology of self-love, right? And what that might look like. And I agree that we should all be engaging in some kind of embodied practice that brings us into a sense of alignment, a sense of feeling powerful, right, in our own bodies. I think that's really important. Part of what this book is trying to lift up that I'm working on is to revise, right? I can certainly speak from my own tradition, right? That I think often, especially in a very hierarchical tradition like mine, we think of faith as compliance, right? And part of what I'm trying to lift up here is I think in Kierkegaard's really like kind of innovative readings of these different women, he's lifting up a notion of faith as social defiance. A few years ago when I was still faculty at Brigham Young University, I put on a conference on forgiveness and reconciliation, and Botutu Ben Firth came to be one of the speakers, and so I got to spend a lot of time with her. And at one point I asked her, what was it like being raised by Desmond Tutu, right? Like, how did your parents raise you? Like, what did it look like to become an activist, right? How did parents do that? And she thought for a minute and she said, I really don't think our parents raised us to be activists. They raised us to be faithful. And that has really stayed with me. I think that's very profound. And so I think, also thinking carefully about what does it mean to you to be faithful, right? In whatever tradition you're working from, in whatever context you're working from, and how do you work into that a notion of activism, a notion of contributing back to the wider society, so that it's just part and parcel of what it means to be a practitioner.
We are running a little short of time, but we'll take one more question.
So, I think both your papers raise this idea, questions about epistemology, narratology, the canon, and the Buddhist tradition. I think the Jataka tales, right? In my intro to Buddhist studies, we got assigned stories, and one of them was Gautama Buddha coming as a bodhisattva. It's our
And in a female body, and she cuts off her breasts to save this woman and her child. This woman's just given birth, and she's gonna eat her child. Because of the intense self-sacrifice, she actually gets healed by it and restored, and gets asked what she wants in return, and she decides to become a man. And when I read this, I was like, this is such a misogynist story. We're chopping off the parts of ourselves that make us a woman. Why did that woman eat the afterbirth? Like, this is someone who wrote this story who doesn't actually know about the embodied spirit experiences of women, right? And then why doesn't she want to keep on, since the Buddha chose in that instantiation to become a woman, why does she gender change? Again, the story explains to do more good, right? And as I read it, again, I just had to say to myself, the writings that we have come through human conduits. And some of our traditions tell us those human conduits are infallible, right? And I just have to be like, who is this author who wrote this down? I have to go look, I've written a short paper, I haven't written a long paper, but I think I got my answer both regionally and time frame about why that story could be even written down that way. And again, there is this balance, right, between us, many of us practicing these traditions that are thousands of years old, and where culture was then. Like when I think about, again, the Old Testament, we have Sarah offering her handmaid so that her husband can have a son, because they didn't promise, right? And what's the likelihood that really went down that way? Right? Like, it's very likely that the husband was like, well, I'm the head of a family, I need to have kids. And you have this female servant around, and you're barren. Because again, patriarchy always is fairness to the woman, right? What about, Hagar? And the wife is just like, family needs to work. We practice our own marriage. Okay, I'm gonna have to say yes, right? I see it, but the story we tell is that the wife came up with this idea, right? For this, again, what we know as this incredibly divided family, Hagar and her son are estranged, right? They're not. Again, is the whole story garbage? No, but I just think a lot of our stories have patriarchal writers, and again, not to even mention like who there's the authorship, there's all the copies, right? All this stuff. So there's all these opportunities, and still we find inspiration more generally in our religion, and we find, I think you both say, practices, historical practices that lift women up and lift us all up again from a womanist tradition, right? And the balance, I think, is going to be different. I'm again like, I would teach that story from my own tradition, the Buddhist tradition, as the subject. And I just love it, it's interesting, there's transgender elements of that story, but I used to be like, this is woman hating. Why would the woman eat her baby? Like, that's crazy, right? So just some thoughts. Any final thoughts?
Well, just a quick observation, that yes, it's misogynist, but you were thinking like a woman, it's like, why don't we eat the afterbirth? So a man clearly wrote that story and couldn't think there's another source of nutrition, and a woman could. So if that's what the text says, and lots of people have read the text, but what we don't have is how the women responded to it. And I bet you're not the only woman who thought that. Through the history, they're reading it and like, this is nonsense, this is crazy. So writing news stories that demonstrate women's ability to see suffering and respond with wisdom and compassion. Those are the stories we need to help balance out what we do.
Yeah, I'm gonna quick comment as well. This is just a fun little FYI. So I know I'm a professor of Latter-day Saint Mormon studies. So within the Book of Mormon, which is a sacred text for Latter-day Saints, you have multiple prophetic figures writing the text and actually stating in the text their own fallibility. And the fact that they recognize that they have made a lot of mistakes, not just in their lives, but in the construction of the text. It is really fascinating to have a book of scripture where that's sort of owned. And I won't suggest to anyone else what you do with your own reading of your scripture, but I think it's a sort of incredible resource to like have that possibility of a text that is both claiming to be scripture and self-consciously admitting its own fallibility. And so I think within my own tradition, there's a lot of generative possibility there. And so I think seeing how you can kind of play with that or a version of that, right, when engaging your own text may or may not be helpful, but I just offer that up.
I'd like to give this panel a final round of applause for a very stimulating afternoon. And now we'll turn the podium over to Dr. Deandra Erickson, GTU Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning, and the presentation of certificates, for a certificate. Thank you, Paula. Greetings, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today. And thank you, Deidre and Paula, for such an insightful and invigorating discussion. The knowledge and passion that you two share today truly embodies the significant work of the GTU and WSR. So thank you so much for your wisdom. I have been on the WSR steering committee for about 2 years now. And during every steering committee meeting and WSR event, I have always felt immense reinvigoration and gratitude. I'm grateful for the opportunities to learn from amazing faculty and students during mentoring sessions, conferences, WSR Speaks events, and these moments have truly grounded me. And it has been an absolute joy to be a part of such an impactful program. Before presenting the certificate, I want to take a moment to acknowledge 2 remarkable women who serve as the backbone of WSR. Diane Saunders and Madhuri Gala, who is not able to be with us today, unfortunately. Diane Saunders is a WSR program coordinator, and she has done amazing work in accomplishing all the necessary logistics to run all of the programs that WSR offers. Diane, it has been such a pleasure working with you. You have been so friendly, approachable, and supportive as the program coordinator, and you have such a kind spirit. Thank you for all of the hard work that you put into the program for the last 2 years, and we hope that you will not be a stranger to WSR. Thank you. Additionally, I would like to acknowledge Majubin Gala, our WSR chair and fearless leader. Majubin has served as the chair for 2 years and will also be stepping down at the end of the semester. Majubin has so many great qualities I don't even know where to start. But she has done an amazing job overseeing the program. And one aspect that I truly value about her is her brilliant ability to create such fruitful spaces of rejuvenation, healing, and productivity. In every steering committee meeting that she's led, she's always held the space with eloquence, kindness, and grace. Even though she is not able to be with us at the moment, we thank her for her leadership for the past 2 years.
Now on to the presentation of the certificate. The mission of the WSR program is to sustain, promote, and advance the commitment to the study of religion, gender, and emphasizing conversations across differences of race, sexual and gender orientation, ethnicity, class, culture, and religious orientation. As part of its mission, the WSR program offers a certificate to GTU students who wish to integrate women's studies to their academic endeavors. Students pursuing the certificate need to complete 3 courses in which experiences of women and women-centered theologies form a significant component. Also need to complete the WSR seminar that is offered every year. And lastly, participate in 3 WSR events. This year, we have 1 student who fulfilled all of these requirements, Mama Sue Rakuchimolal. Mama Sue is a PhD student in religion and practice, focusing on constructing a liberative and transformative model of theological education through a feminist and womanist lens. I have worked with Mama Sue on many occasions, and she is a stellar student, and her warm and enthusiastic presence helps make the GTU a better place. Thank you, Mama Sue, and congratulations.
Yeah, that's. Okay. Thank you.
Now we have come to the end of our afternoon together in formal time. Mary Daly used to distinguish between tidy time, and that's the chronological time of the clock, and tidal time, which is the spillover, the qualitative continuation of our interaction and exchange of ideas, thoughts, in this case, over a reception. So I invite all of us to close out tidy time and enter the tidal time together. Thank you.
So say especially a thank you to Dr. Paula Nesbitt for stepping into this role today, very gracefully. And please, there's just a lot of wonderful food by Summer Bakery. So really enjoy the time together. And I think the small in number maybe might even spirit. I think we laid groundwork for a beautiful program. As we see today, a very important program going forward to get this opportunity